guys ready? Good afternoon and welcome to our Newsmakers series. We're glad to welcome Dr. and Mrs. Alasky back to our campus for the series of important interviews. And today promises to be a very exciting interview with Lee Goodman, who is a federal election commissioner member who was nominated by President Obama. And I'm sure that's a story we'll get to hear, so that's good. Goodman was previously an advisor to the governor of Virginia, the Attorney General of Virginia, and 4 presidential candidates. He is also the General Counsel for the Republican Party of Virginia. So let's give both he and Dr. Alasky a warm welcome.
So Lee, you grew up in Danville, Virginia, and you actually played football at Danville High School?
George Washington
High School.
I did. I played on a team that finished second in the state of Virginia in 1982 and had at least 2 or 3 professional football players, eventual professional football players on it. And I was a second string defensive back.
Okay.
And learned a lot playing football growing up. Learned a lot about effort and teamwork. And learned a lot about people, certainly.
So how is being a defensive back like being a federal election commissioner?
Well, the other side's always trying to take away your, if you look at yardage, like First Amendment rights, the other side's always trying to take away your First Amendment rights, and as a defensive back, you're constantly defending the Constitution.
Okay. And then you went to University of Virginia both as an undergraduate and then for law school.
I did. I began the University of Virginia in the fall of 1982, and I graduated in May of 1986 with a double major in American government and rhetoric and communications, both a combination of classical rhetorical studies as well as more modern media criticism. I took a year off after college, went to work in Washington, D.C. Started as just a volunteer, living literally on the floor of friends' apartments until I was employed. And I worked a year in Washington for, at the time, Vice President George Bush and his Political Action Committee. And then I went back to law school, back to Charlottesville, and I went to law school from 1987 to 1990, and graduated from 1990, and then embarked on the practice of law.
And you practiced through the 1990s.
Did.
And then in 2000, back with the Bush family in a way on the great Hanging Chad campaign, or the post-election debates in Florida. Were you there in Florida actually looking at?
No, I was in Texas, but there was one other thing, one detour I took in my practice of law before I got to Austin, Texas on the election night of 2000. And the reason I stopped to mention it is because, especially for your students here who are, I assume, looking at the paths other people took to engage in public service. Many people think of Washington, D.C. as the mecca of public service in Washington, and actually I found as fulfilling 7 years in state government. So in 1995, I left the private practice of law, and I became an assistant attorney general and then later counsel to the Attorney General of Virginia, a fellow named Jim Gilmore. And then in 1997, he ran for governor of Virginia, and I went and became the policy director on his statewide campaign for governor. And then I spent 4 years in the governor's office as a legal counsel and policy advisor to the governor. Those were very fulfilling years. And for the students here at Patrick Henry who are thinking about getting involved, I highly commend state and local government as a place where you can actually impact people's lives in a very tangible way. And those were very fulfilling. That was a very fulfilling 7-year stint for me in state government. Then,
so your advice is don't run off to Washington with stars in your eyes. Go to Richmond or state capitals. And
there is a state capital near you, and I think that you can find great fulfillment and great training, and bring your policies and your ideals to bear at a state level and have direct impact far greater than you can have from Washington, D.C.
Okay. Well, you mentioned being in Austin on election night 2000, and since students here were perhaps 5 years old at that time, can you just give a little flavor of that night and probably the weirdest election night in American political history?
Sure. what you're doing, what I did was I took vacation. I was working for Governor Jim Gilmore at the time, and I took vacation time to go to Austin, Texas and work telephones on Election Day.
Okay.
They needed lawyers to answer telephone calls. Various election administration issues come up during the day, and we answered many telephone calls. Late poll openings in St. Louis, those types of things. And you're fielding calls, and you're giving advice to people out there. That night, when the polls are closed and the votes are coming in, you're watching the national news. Florida was called for Governor Bush. And everyone was elated because that was probably the tipping point in the election. And within approximately an hour, the national networks took Florida off of the board and called it for Gore. And everyone was very sad. So it was a roller coaster night. I believe I'm not sure whether it got called for Bush again or whether it went into a too close to call category. But there were peaks and valleys in the emotions in the national headquarters of Governor Bush's campaign that night. Finally, it appears that Bush has won. That's it. They did call it again for Bush. And everyone is elated, and everyone heads up State Street in Austin, Texas to the state capitol, where there are jumbotrons and lights and cameras, and everyone is expecting for Governor Bush to appear to give his victory speech that night in Austin. And it's very late because of the problems in calling that election. And on the jumbotron, I remember Candy Crowley on CNN announced that Vice President Gore's motorcade had turned around. Vice President Gore was headed to give a concession speech. Well, there is no template for this, right? No one's ever been through this. And so there was to be no concession speech that night. There was to be no victory speech, and the election went into limbo. Now, I stayed in Austin, Texas for about the next 8 days as we deployed lawyers from around the country to Florida. Florida had a unique recount system. Unlike my home state of Virginia, where you go through an organized canvass post-election, in Florida, recounts could be requested on the spot the very next day. And so recounts were being requested in particularly close jurisdictions by Democratic lawyers mining for votes in specific counties where they thought a recount would produce additional votes for them. Right. And that's how and when the beginnings of what became a very legally problematic recount began, because they were recounting ballots locality by locality according to disparate standards like a patchwork quilt. It was our job to keep track of all that. One thing that we did do from Austin was we insisted on consistent standards across counties, and we insisted that the lawyers we deployed to various counties keep a record of the standards that were being applied to the count, because we already knew we had an equal protection and due process problem in the making. And so that's what we did for about 8 days. In about a week and a half, about the 9th or 10th day, the center of gravity for the Bush legal effort had moved to Florida. And there was no more need for me in Austin. But we monitored every recount in the days after the election. We deployed lawyers there, and we watched very closely the standards that were being applied to counting ballots post-election.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating night. My wife and I were there on Congress Avenue, where the stands were set up for the eventual victory announcement. And at one point there was since I was involved a little bit with Bush at that time, there was a BBC reporter interviewing me, and he was gloating because he was very, very pro-Gore, and Bush was losing at that point. And he was saying, well, what went wrong and this and that. And then suddenly there was an enormous cheer from the crowd as it went up that actually the call of Florida for Gore was now being reversed, and the BBC reporter's face fell. And anyway, it was that type of roller coaster night. So anytime you want to do a paper on American political history or something like that, look at that time. It was just a fascinating evening. Okay, then the next decade, you spent a lot of that as a registered lobbyist for AOL, Time Warner in Washington. What was that experience like?
Well, in 2002, Two, Virginia has a term-limited governor, so I turned off the lights with Governor Gilmore in Richmond, and I went back to the private practice of law. And a portion of my practice was lobbying as well. I prided myself in being sort of an all-purpose attorney, and I looked for ways to solve clients' problems, sometimes through advice, sometimes through litigation, sometimes by engaging what we call jawboning regulators at regulatory agencies, and sometimes by lobbying lawmakers to solve their problem without going through the multi-year expense of litigation. For example, challenging a law. Sometimes you can get that law challenged changed in a matter of months. So I practiced law. I practiced election law, nonprofit law. I did some litigation, but I also lobbied. And I lobbied principally on the issue of maintaining tax freedom for the internet. And so I represented Time Warner and AOL for about 5 years in trying to extend the Internet Tax Freedom Act in Congress so that internet access charges that people pay didn't have telephone taxes imposed on them, and also trying to keep the commerce that people do across state boundaries as tax-free as possible so that consumers could be empowered with lower prices, so that the internet economy could take off, and so that internet access didn't become so encumbered with a very complicated and onerous tax system in the same way that telephone service had become over the years. And one thing I always have taken pride in is I've never lobbied for an interest that I didn't personally believe in. So maintaining a low tax burden on consumers, a low tax regulatory system for merchants and internet service providers was very important to me. And we did win extensions of the Internet Tax Freedom Act. I also lobbied in Richmond, Virginia for favorable tax policy to online commerce. Virginia had invested a fair amount of its economic development dollars into encouraging the development of the technology industry here, especially here in Northern Virginia. And we then didn't want to begin taxing it away or exposing Virginia's infrastructure of information technology to the tax burdens of the other 49 states. Yeah. So those were the issues that I lobbied on, and we were largely successful, and some of the work that we did continues to this day.
So I tend, as do most journalists, to have a jaundiced view of lobbyists. And in fact, there's a general belief out there that lobbyists are evil and must be caged in some way. This seems to be one of the rare times where a lobbyist is actually defending freedom rather than chipping away at it in some way to the advantage of his organization as opposed to other organizations. And it just seems strange in a way that, given the tendency of government, if it moves, tax it, that actually the internet's pretty free, and you can actually send around, every time you send around an email message, you don't have to pay the government something for the privilege of doing that. It seems almost a golden age in that way. How long will this last?
Well, there are efforts to harness taxes on every bit and byte of information that you send over the internet every day, whether it's going to be a transaction sales tax, or whether it's going to be a bit and byte tax, or whether it's harnessing telephone tax systems onto VoIP, voice over internet protocol. Government's appetite for revenues is voracious, and the age-old fight between more government and surrendering more power to government, whether it's in individual rights or whether it's your money, versus individual freedom to keep more of your money and engage in commerce and communications freely, that debate continues to this day in virtually every sphere of our lives. Now, going back to, yes, I understand the pejorative understanding of lobbyists.
Right.
But many lobbyists are not working for large paid business corporations. They're working for nonprofit organizations and lobbying for causes. And the right to petition your government is enshrined in the First Amendment. And I don't know where we would be if you did not have a right to petition your government for grievances and for policy preferences. So lobbyists are heavily regulated. Everything I did is fully disclosed. You can go online right now and look at the Senate Clerk's office or the House Clerk's office and find my lobbyist registration reports, precisely how much I was paid by Time Warner and AOL, precisely the issues that I lobbied for. It was never a secret, but it's all fully disclosed. And the disclosure regime protects against backroom deals. And, but no, I believe that petitioning your government, even as a paid lobbyist, whether it's for a cause or an industry or a labor union, whatever the issue is a precious right of Americans, and we should not denigrate it.
Well, and there may be a tendency among journalists to denigrate it because it's an alternative source of information. And in a way, it can break against certain press monopolies at times and so forth. So anyway, but you moved from there then eventually to the FEC. And the FEC, some students here may be familiar with it, a lot I suspect aren't. So can you give us a basic, a 1-minute summary of what the FEC is? I mean, perhaps students know that there are 6 commissioners, not more than 3 can be from any particular party. Why is it set up that way? When was it set up? And what are some of the complications of it being set up that way?
Congress had a reporting regime for congressional campaigns beginning in about 1909. But well into the late 1960s, people who ran for Congress and got elected were not complying with it. They were not reporting their receipts and expenses for their campaigns. So in 1971, Congress created the Federal Election Commission to be the clearinghouse and the enforcement agency to make sure that everyone who ran for public office at the federal level filed disclosure reports showing all money into their campaigns and all expenditures out.
Okay, and is that a good thing to have?
That is. I
Okay.
support the disclosure mission of the Federal Election Commission.
Okay.
Now, and then after the Watergate scandals of 1972 and 3, Congress enacted a new regulatory regime for all those campaign finances, moving beyond just disclosure to enact a system of limits on contributions in the early 1974 amendments, limits on expenditures by campaigns, and corporate and labor union prohibitions on making donations. And so those amendments to the 1971 Act form the basis for what we continue to enforce at the FEC today. But what had happened along the way from 1974 to today were several Supreme Court decisions that recalibrated the regulatory restrictions based on First Amendment rights. Some restrictions have been struck over the last 35 years as violative of the First Amendment. Others are still in place. So contribution limits to campaigns are still in place. The disclosure requirements are still in place. And what the FEC does is we are the clearinghouse. If you want to know any contribution to or expenditure by any candidate for Congress or presidency or the political parties, you can look at fec.gov and you can find all of those expenditures and all of those contributions reported right out there in the sunlight.
So, so disclosure is very good. What about limits on campaign contributions? What do you think about that?
I have not been a strong advocate of completely eliminating the contribution limits. There's certainly a strong case to be made that, take for example here in Virginia. I worked in the political system here in Virginia for a number of years. Virginia has no contribution limits, no source prohibitions, so labor unions and business corporations and nonprofit corporations can give freely to candidates in Virginia, and they do. So, in Richmond, Virginia, some corporations give donations to both major candidates for governor, for example, and they view that as civic participation. It's actually considered quite virtuous in some circles. At the federal level, those corporate contributions are viewed as corruptive and evil. So I have seen systems work quite well with full disclosure, and the voters can hold candidates accountable if they don't like the corporate or labor union contributions they're receiving. And the media is quite effective at taking those disclosures and putting the information out for people to consider. So I don't know that the contribution limits are absolutely essential to having a government that is responsive to the people and that is non-corrupted, okay? But we do have a system of limits. I do believe the limits are quite severe, and I would support at least lifting the limits, raising the limits. I believe we could easily give candidates $5,000 per election. Right now, the limit, if you're running for Congress or Senate, I can give your campaign $2,700 per election. I think I should be able to give it at least $5,000 without the potential that I'm going to corrupt you as a candidate. All of these limits, by the way, are prophylactic. The law does not say that a contribution of $5,000 or $10,000, for example, that would be excessive, is inherently evil or wrong. They're saying that the Congress made the judgment that the limit of $2,700 is a reasonable line to draw as a prophylactic against the potential that some politician might be weak and might sell their fidelity to their constituents or their ideals to an individual donor. The number $2,700 right now is a fairly arbitrary line. But there's nothing inherently evil about a larger contribution. It's just that we want to prevent what it might result in, which is a corrupted politician. So I'm prepared to live within the regime we have and the limits we have. I think we could raise them without exposing ourselves to any greater potential for corruption.
Okay, and those are limits on money given directly to a candidate, but of course there are the PACs and the super PACs, essentially, that don't have limits. Does it create, we're having limits in that way about money you can directly control, but not having limits about money that comes in that you cannot directly control, but is set up by people who really believe in your campaign or want to do that, want to advocate that? Does that create a difficulty when you have money designed to help a candidate but flowing independently? I'm just curious as to this double standard, in a sense, that we have right now.
The double standard you refer to was established by the Supreme Court in 1976 in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo. If you're looking it up, it's 424 U.S. 1.
There it is.
And in Buckley v. Vallejo, remember what Congress had done in '74. They had imposed limits not just on contributions to campaigns, but on expenditures by campaigns. And the Supreme Court struck all limits on expenditures, including what the court called independent expenditures. Now, some people believe that the concern we have about large, wealthy spenders making their own independent expenditures, independent of the candidates, started with Citizens United in 2010, and that's not the case. Okay. The Supreme Court approved unlimited independent expenditures in 1976, and they have occurred since 1976. So if David Koch or if Michael Bloomberg wanted to make large independent expenditures, they were free to do that long before the Citizens United decision. What the court did in Buckley v. Vallejo, it said, if you're making a contribution to a candidate, that is a form of association. You are providing support to the candidate, but it is not in and of itself speech. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there is a compelling governmental interest to limit it, to protect against corruption, and the First Amendment right implicated is of lesser importance than speech itself. However, if you are spending your own resources to fund your own speech independent of the candidate, that is pure speech at the core of the protection of the First Amendment, because it is core speech about democracy. And you have an unlimited right to spend your own resources to fund that speech. Now, from 1976 to 2010, another restriction remained in place, however. If Marvin, you and I got together and wanted to pool our resources, and we incorporated our association for all the reasons that people incorporate, we lost our First Amendment rights to exercise that Buckley right of independent speech. So in 2010, what the Supreme Court said was, Marvin and Lee can incorporate our association, pool our resources, and exercise the Buckley right of independent speech, notwithstanding the fact that we are incorporated. And that applied The restriction applied before Citizens United, and the freedom now applies after Citizens United, not just to business corporations, but to incorporated labor organizations, incorporated nonprofit organizations. So that's why we have the two-tiered system. Money going directly to candidates is deemed potentially corruptive. Money spent by organizations and individuals to fund their own independent speech is deemed less corruptive because there is no negotiation point between the candidate and the spender, or at least there's not supposed to be. So that's why we have the two-tiered system. Now what we have is this line of independence is the elephant in the room. Mm-hmm. It's called the legal doctrine is called coordination. There is supposed to be no coordination between the candidate and the independent spender, because if you're the candidate, Marvin, and I'm the independent spender, and I can only give you $2,700 per election, but if I could walk up to you and say, Marvin, I'm going to spend $1 million, how would you like me to spend it? And you tell me, I need billboards discussing my position on the Second Amendment in the southwest part of the state. I'll say, consider it done, Marvin. You can see how that's tantamount to me giving you the $1 million. The problem comes in defining what is coordinating activity and what is not. Now, the Federal Election Commission spent the better part of a decade trying to divine and interpret and define that line, and was rebuffed by courts for overreaching in that line. There's a famous case from the late 1990s where the Christian Coalition was passing out voter guides to people on Sundays and at other rallies and gatherings to show people what the positions were of the competing candidates on important values issues. And they discussed the creation of those flyers as well as their distribution with candidates in their campaigns. Mm-hmm. And the Federal Election Commission thought, aha, we've got a case of coordination. All of those expenditures by the Christian Coalition were coordinated with President Bush seeking re-election in 1992, with Jesse Helms, with Oliver North and other candidates. And a federal court rejected the Federal Election Commission's theory and said, Federal Election Commission, you've overreached. Discussion about these issue advertisements, these position papers and distribution, cannot be the subject of a coordination case. So what people are concerned about now is that the coordination doctrine is too porous.
Right.
And it allows too many points of knowledge and intersection. And that is probably the greatest challenge we face now after Citizens United.
Or let's say that I don't tell you that, wow, I could use $1 million spent on Second Amendment billboards in the southeast part of the district. But instead of telling you that, a reporter has asked me, well, what are the needs of your campaign? And I tell the reporter exactly that. The reporter writes that in a story. You read that, and you act appropriately then, according to my interest. Would that be coordination?
That is not, because it's in the public domain.
Right.
And by the way, to the extent you even wanted to consider that coordination, at least it is coordination in the public domain. In other words, anybody can hold you accountable at that point. By the way, you read stories now about some of that occurring. Candidates post their plans on their websites for the public to determine. Now, you cannot, through a legal doctrine of coordination, prohibit an independent spender from reading what's in the public domain and reacting to it. Your independent speech would be far less effective if you couldn't read the newspaper and decide how can I speak most effectively.
So insofar as it is so easy to coordinate in that way without directly coordinating, is the double standard so porous that it's going to go?
You've asked a pretty profound question there.
Once in a while, I might do that.
Because what some people conclude is, now that the Supreme Court has recognized this First Amendment right to spend unlimited sums, by the way, really not just recently, but beginning in 1976, and because the doctrine of coordination and the restrictions that government can impose under the doctrine of coordination is not as impermeable as people would like. For example, I can't restrict the fact that you know me, that you're an independent spender who knows me, for example. Some people want to restrict that.
Okay.
The fact that we have a personal relationship and you're making independent expenditures, they want to impute coordination just because we know each other. I can't restrict your First Amendment rights just because you know me. Everybody knows everybody in politics, okay? Or has met somebody somewhere along the way. So I honestly believe that what the Supreme Court has done and the supercharging of independent expenditures under the Citizens United doctrine, what it has done is it has shined a light on the limits of government to restrict independent expenditures under broader theories of coordination. And indeed, it is causing a lot of academics and legal scholars and others to question, why do we have to go through this dance of forcing people to spend their money through independent organizations where everyone can speak to each other through public fora, right? It is making people question whether or not we should get rid of contribution limits altogether and go to the Virginia model and quit the contortion of independent super PACs and allow that money to be brought into the campaigns directly, fully disclosed, and let the voters hold the candidates accountable for the positions they take and who may be calling their tune. I'm not here advocating that today, but it does put pressure on the whole system of contribution limits, no doubt.
So, and that pressure is likely to increase as things go by, and perhaps the Donald Trump campaign this year will increase the pressure as people start saying, well, Donald Trump, of course, can spend an unlimited amount of his own money, but let's say that Marco Rubio had a billionaire brother. Could the brother give money to Marco Rubio to spend on the campaign? I understand no, according to the existing law.
The Supreme Court held this a long time ago. Family members are subject to the same contribution limit as anybody else. I wince a little bit at that notion that somehow your spouse, your spouse may be wealthier than you, or a brother is somehow going to corrupt you, but the Supreme Court has said it applies to everybody. One thing that the Supreme Court also ruled, however, is that Donald Trump has a First Amendment right to spend unlimited personal resources because Donald Trump cannot possibly corrupt Donald Trump.
Okay.
But yes, the fact that wealthy individuals have an advantage in the political process and can spend unlimited amounts of their own money and take advantage of people who do not have large personal wealth also calls into question the contribution limits as well.
Let me ask about another matter that in a sense, changing technology and styles of journalism may affect. As we were talking earlier at lunch, there's been a strong divide between the rights of press organizations to pursue certain things as compared to the rights of non-press organizations. But insofar as the internet and so many other things have democratized, to a certain extent, publication, I mean, any of you in this audience can become your own editor and publisher this afternoon if you wish to do so. Is that divide going to at some point seem part of the past rather than something that's still workable?
Little history here, which we discussed over lunch. When Congress enacted all of these contribution and expenditure regulations in 1974, Congress recognized a problem if they subjected the press. And of course, in 1974, the press looked very different than the press looks today. But certainly for bona fide identifiable press, whether it was CBS or the Washington Post, Congress realized that under both the First Amendment and the Free Press Clause of the Constitution, as well as a matter of policy, Congress should not regulate the press in bringing news content and indeed editorial comment about politicians and elections to the people. So in our statute is an explicit exemption for the press. Now that exemption has been refined by the courts over time. The courts have given us a test. If you are a bona fide press entity conducting the regular function of the press, disseminating news, editorial comment to the people, and publishing regularly, then you are exempt from our regulatory regime altogether. And large, well-funded press organizations like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and CBS have been discussing and indeed editorializing about candidates since the 1970s. And no one questions those large corporate expenditures. No one really questions the influence they have over the political process. In the new era, defining who is the press,
Right.
given the rise of new media, are podcasters the press? Are bloggers who publish regularly the press? Are filmmakers who post their films for free as videos on YouTube? Are they bona fide filmmakers entitled to the press clause of the First Amendment? The new media and the rise of new media have blurred the old distinctions. And I believe those who want to keep the harnesses of regulation on people and organizations see that there is an easy way for people now to become unregulated, and that is to comport themselves in the new media world as the press. Now,
Right.
I support that. I support new publishers coming up. I believe that blogs are the press. They're like the old-timey pamphleteers,
Right.
if you will. And so I have taken a very broad view of the definition of the press. For those who want to keep the harnesses of regulation on the American people, they view the press exemption and the rise of new media as a bit like holding the wolf by the ears, that the exception could swallow the whole rule as more and more people become the press. So that's issue number one.
Okay.
For those who believe in greater regulation. Issue number two is what happens when new media pops up and they publish solely on the internet, and are we going to start regulating every website and blog if we do not recognize them as bona fide press? Are we going to start combing the internet on a daily basis to see who's publishing what on the internet and how much money are they spending on their blog? In the late 1990s, the Federal Election Commission issued an advisory opinion to a man who created a website saying that he needed to account for the cost of his computer, his software, his internet connection, his monthly internet connection charge, and a web hosting cost, and attribute a cost to all of those as an regulated expenditure. By 2006, the Commission realized how unrealistic that was. And so in 2006, the Commission adopted a regulation that exempted all free posting out there on the internet. And the only thing that we regulate on the internet today is a paid advertisement. If you're paying AOL.com or the WashingtonPost.com website an advertising fee to post your banner that contains electoral content, we consider that a paid ad just as if you put it in the paper edition of the Washington Post. And we regulate that as an expenditure. But if you're posting your own website or you're posting free videos on YouTube and the dissemination cost is free there, we don't regulate that. Now, there have been debates within the Commission to rethink the 2006 rule as more and more people are going online, as political speech online is becoming more widely available and effective, as the next generation of Americans get all or most of their content online, not necessarily on television. There are some who want to regulate more, and they have sought to reopen the 2006 rulemaking, and I have steadfastly opposed it. And over the last year, we've had a fairly robust debate about that.
Yeah, fairly robust is a very nice way of saying where you have a divided FEC with 3 Democrats appointees, essentially, and 3 Republican appointees, and people don't always play nice, it seems, at least from what I'm reading in the press as far as characterizations. In fact, let me just read one. This is the chairman right now of the FEC, Ann Ravel. That's the way you pronounce her name. Is that correct?
That is.
Who said last week that the FEC is enormously dysfunctional And she compared the agency's effectiveness to men's nipples as something that really wasn't, well, I'm not sure what she meant by that. Perhaps you could explain. And while you're explaining that, people out here might think of questions they want to ask on these frontiers of election science. But what did she mean by that, and what's going on?
I cannot speak for precisely what our chair meant. Let me just say this. We debate big issues at the Federal Election Commission. These are big, weighty, profound issues, balancing on a daily basis First Amendment rights on the one hand versus a law that Congress enacted to regulate money in politics to prevent the corruption of candidates and politicians on the other. And you can step back and debate that balance and whether there should be many of these regulations as an academic matter. But the fact is Congress has enacted them. The courts have allowed some of them to proceed. The court has restricted others. And we on a daily basis are at the meeting street of those two access points, and we debate them on a daily basis. And it is hard to go to work every day and to debate somebody every day without occasionally those debates getting somewhat emotional. So, but I have gotten along well with Chair Ravel, and I don't want to be misinterpreted as anything other than having respect for our chair and liking her personally. But we have had these debates, and these are profound debates. And sometimes I believe people decide to take a tact in debates which are perhaps less dignified or perhaps not perhaps as at a higher plane perhaps that I prefer to discuss them. So you have to ask the chair about what she meant by that comment, all I can say is I try very hard to stay on the issues, and I try very hard to respect people's First Amendment rights. The term dysfunction really is a narrative. It is a narrative that says, I'm not winning the law and the philosophy 100% of the time. And so when I'm not winning the majority votes, I'm going to call anything short of my philosophy winning as dysfunctional. Congress set up a 6-member body. By the way, I believe there's probably only one other agency that is an even number. All of the other independent agencies in Washington are an odd number. They're typically 3-2. We are 3-3 for a reason, because we are the umpires of the baseball game. And when the players of the baseball game designed us, that is, the members of Congress, that neither team wanted to give the other side the right to set up all the rules of the game and call all the balls and strikes. So they set up an even-numbered body, and by statute, they required 4 votes to take any regulatory action or any enforcement action. Now, when Congress set up a 6-member body, Congress fully contemplated that some votes of the commission would break 6-0. And some would naturally break 5-1. And I've been the number 1 in several 5-1 votes. Some would break 4-2. We have a good number of 4-2 votes. That means we proceed and take action. And Congress understood that some votes would break 3-3. So Congress designed us this way and understood that some issues would break 3-3. Now, last year when I was chair, I worked very hard. I would give Commissioner Ravel credit for working very hard last year as well, to try to find consensus where we could, to control the number of cases where we were probably going to divide 3-3, to manage those, to try to find middle ground and compromises where we could, for example, on advisory opinions. And I was very proud that under my helmsmanship of the agency, in all the votes that we took, and I'm talking about both substantive regulatory issues as well as the administrative matters, like approving our budget and the distribution of funds in the agency, we got to a majority vote in 93% of all the votes we took. Now, that's a lot of families would be doing pretty good to agree or have a majority position in 93% of all family decisions. taking just the substantive matters, the advisory opinions, the regulatory rulemakings, the enforcement votes, and I count all the votes taken. I apply no methodology to picking and choosing the votes that we take. We reached a majority vote in 86% of the votes that we take. And this is in an area of hot contention and philosophical division, right? So the fact that we divided our votes 3-3 on 14% of the substantive votes, to me means we're quite we are quite a functional agency, and that the narrative of dysfunction is really a philosophical complaint, and it needs to be understood as such.
It's helpful. Questions from anyone or comments?
So how does an issue come up before the FEC? What's the process?
Several routes, and it depends on the type of issue. So let me start by discussing what our responsibilities are, and each one comes before us in a different route. So the first thing we do is we can promulgate regulations. Congress gave us a skeletal act, the Federal Election Campaign Act. It's not very thick in paper. And then we have a set of regulations that provide the granular level detail on that act, and it's 3 times or more in density, okay? And rulemakings can be undertaken at the initiative of any commissioner. Just yesterday we had a public meeting, and I proposed a proposal to free state and local parties from a number of our regulations. I believe that state and local parties are the lifeblood of our democracy. They are small d democratic institutions. They harness the populist political efforts of many citizens. I made this case to the commission, and I proposed a set of regulatory changes to free up the state and local political parties. I put it before the commission at a public meeting. We debated it. My proposal failed by a vote of 3-3. The vote was along party lines. We can also be petitioned by any citizen to undertake a rulemaking. So through numerous ways, a rulemaking idea can come into the agency. We then have to vote to proceed, and it takes 4 votes to proceed to a rulemaking. Sometimes one of our regulations will be challenged in court, and a court will rule some aspect of our regulation to be unlawful, contrary to the statute, or unconstitutional, and send us back to the drawing board on our regulation. Second, we issue advisory opinions to people who want to engage in some democratic activity. They have the right, under the statute, to come to us to ask for advice before they act. If they can obtain an advisory opinion from the commission, they then have a shield against any political liability, and some people want the clarity before they undertake political activity. By the way, I think it's somewhat unfortunate people feel obliged to come to their government to ask permission to engage in democratic activity, but that's what we do. And so any individual can come to the commission and make a request for an advisory opinion. You just write a letter to the commission. You say, I'd like an advisory opinion. And we issue advisory opinions. Sometimes we divide our votes 3-3 on those, leaving an individual citizen or organization in some limbo. But we've been pretty good about cobbling together 4 or more votes on advisory opinions. Third, enforcement actions. That's where someone is alleged to have violated the law. Any citizen can file a complaint with the Federal Election Commission alleging that any other citizen has violated the Federal Election Campaign Act. There are some requirements for such a complaint. You must swear to it under oath and submit it. And once you do that, it then goes through our enforcement process. Now, Congress set in several hurdles. Just because Congress understood that people might use the enforcement process to attack their political opponents. So Congress put in several procedural safeguards and hurdles to get over for those complaints. And then we vote on whether to proceed past each hurdle in the enforcement process. Those are the 3 principal activities we engage in: rulemakings, advisory opinions, and enforcements. We do a lot of educational programs for people to teach them how to comply, those types of things. We are the clearinghouse for all the reports you file. Those who are regulated by us and file reports get regular series of questions back from the agency about the reports that they file. We do all those things. But those are the three main ways that matters come before us and that we vote on.
Other questions?
Yeah, my question is relative to how someone goes about, or not, what triggers someone to pursue some sort of legal action against another candidate. Like you sort of started talking about it towards the end of what you were just saying. But who keeps track of? Do the candidates have? You mentioned an army of lawyers back at the beginning of the interview. Who keeps track of what the other political candidates are up to and what they're doing with the money and who's donating, how much they're donating, and all those different aspects? How does one keep something from slipping under the radar?
Because of the complexity of the regulatory scheme, participation in democracy today is a full-time regulated industry. And whether you're a nonprofit advocacy group, indeed many churches where ministers want to engage in political activity, need lawyers. I don't know if that's a fortunate aspect of this, but in fact, it's an unfortunate aspect.
Good for lawyers' employment, though.
It's good for treasurers and accountants and lawyers, absolutely. And indeed, many lawyers in Washington, D.C. would joke that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, also known as the McCain-Feingold Law, was nicknamed the Election Lawyers Relief Act because it kept more lawyers employed, engaging in compliance advice. So nobody in their right mind engages in political activity today, whether you're lobbying, whether you're a nonprofit group that wants to engage in some type of issue advocacy or electoral advocacy, and certainly no campaign or political party or political action committee today would be wise to undertake their political activity without employing a lawyer. There is a cost to all of this regulation, and the cost comes directly out of the First Amendment activity. Because if you have a finite amount of resource to spend on your mission or your cause, and you have to divert some of that to legal compliance, it is a drag on your exercise of your First Amendment rights. So campaigns have to employ treasurers or accountants to file their reports. Typically, they also employ a lawyer to advise on the legality of what they're doing. Now, remember, everything that you do is publicly disclosed. All of the money in and all of the money out is fully disclosed to the commission. And so political opponents and political detractors are watching that, and they are looking for violations. At the same time, the Federal Election Commission is reviewing your reports that come in. The Federal Election Commission we have a reports analysis division. People who review all of those reports, not by paper. They have sophisticated software systems that run through all the numbers, and they can spot, for example, excessive contributions from one individual. And they send letters out back to the campaign. Again, you should consider this all regulatory burden, right? To answer that letter when it comes back, because you have to answer that letter. If you don't answer that letter, and to the satisfaction of the reports analysis division, then you get audit points. You trigger enough audit points, and now guess what's going to happen? Auditors from the Federal Election Commission are going to come in and audit your organization from top to bottom, and while there may have been 5 or 10 things that triggered the audit, they can look at any other potential problem you may have while they are looking under the hood of your organization. All of this carries regulatory cost to you, and it subtracts from your political activity and speech. So yes, detractors and opponents are regularly looking for fault and regularly filing complaints at the Federal Election Commission. It is our job as commissioners to be a screen so that only bona fide and serious complaints go to the level of enforcement. Now, you should also note, I wholeheartedly support the private attorney general system on which we're based. Congress said any citizen can file a complaint and initiate a complaint. But if you're going to have a system like that, and you know some people are going to try to take advantage of their political opponents and impose the stigma on them, because the second somebody files a complaint, you know what it's usually accompanied by, is a press release. Then the cost of responding to that complaint, by the way, you know what else the stigma can do to someone who faces a complaint? It can chase off their supporters. Supporters who are risk averse and all of a sudden see, oh my goodness, they may be violating the law. It now, in addition to the stigma, it is taking away from them money, because they're having to pay lawyers and people to respond, right? And then in addition to that, it freezes some conduct. If somebody files a complaint against you for engaging in a certain activity, many times your lawyers will tell you, you better stop that activity while the Federal Election Commission is watching it, so it stops you in your tracks. So it's okay that we have a system where anybody can file that complaint. But if you're going to have a system like that, you must have a system like Congress set up of 6 commissioners, and you have to empower both sides, both teams in the baseball game, and allow 3 to block what they view as unmerited complaints. So that's why I would not go to a 3-2 organization like other agencies.
So this is educational. Can you tell us, we have several minutes left, can you tell us about what's going on with this year's campaign and the debates among the candidates? Because I suspect that has generated some complaints coming your way.
First, I cannot confirm or deny the existence of a complaint at the Federal Election Commission by law. And frankly, if complaints are filed right now, I don't even typically look at the complaints as they're filed. I wait till they bubble up to us, although I do have access to that. So I'm not going to confirm or deny any complaints. The one issue that we have had cause to discuss recently, because of the number of debates, and that I have written on recently, is the issue of the extent to which the federal government and the Federal Election Commission can regulate media-sponsored debates. And so I issued a statement recently where I took issue with a circa 1979, 1980 regulation of the Commission, where the Commission asserted regulatory authority over press organizations when they sponsor debates. I looked at the history of debate sponsorship, and there is a long history of both broadcast stations as well as newspapers and other press entities sponsoring and staging debates as part of its news gathering function. And I believe that the press is wholly exempted from our regulations under the press exemption when they sponsor debates. And yet we have a regulation on the books that tells the press what type of criteria, that they have to have certain criteria. They can't stage debates to favor one side or the other. We have a series of regulations, and I believe those regulations are ultra vires, extra statutory beyond both our First Amendment right as well as the statutory right, and it's never been tested in court. We recently had a petition by an organization that wanted us to impose greater restrictions on debate sponsors, including press organizations. By a 4-2 vote, we did not proceed with that rulemaking to impose greater conditions on debate sponsors. And I issued my own statement explaining one reason why I opposed that petition was because I think we probably are already overextended in our regulatory jurisdiction in in regulating debates as much as we are.
Okay. Any further questions right now? Then I think, given the time, that we are done. And please join me in thanking Lee Goodman for coming today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.